Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this for a really long time. I want to thank Patrick for inviting me to be here. I'd like to thank Sandra, wherever she is, for arranging for me to be here. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's a privilege for me to speak to you. Now, I do want to put you at ease before I get started. Despite my Harvard affiliation, I want you to know I really am a Christian. And I did come from California, but I'm originally from Canada. And I'm not sure if you know this, but Canadians have three things in common. We love hockey, we have about 9 months of good ice fishing, and we love Tim Hortons coffee. So you can imagine how excited I was when I was driving from the airport to my hotel, and I saw almost at every exit there was a sign for Tim Hortons coffee, because I didn't think that there were any outside of Canada. And you can imagine how disappointed I was when I went to 3 of them and found that they all closed at 6 o'clock. Tonight, my topic is Know Your Culture, Know Yourself, Social Imaginaries, Values, and Deconstruction. That is a huge handle. I'm going to hopefully try and break this down and make some sense out of it for us. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time talking with people who once identified as Christians and no longer do. They say things like, I used to be really passionate, and I love Jesus, and I read my Bible all the time, but not anymore. In fact, I don't think that it's true. And some of them will say, I have deconstructed right out of my Christian faith. And what I would like to do tonight is talk to you about social imaginaries and values. And the reason why I want to do that is because those are the 2 hidden factors that almost always are driving or that are fueling what sometimes people call deconstruction. And unless you're aware of those, unless those are brought to your conscious awareness, you won't realize it, but they will be acting for you, kind of like the way currents underneath the water direct and move the boats that are sitting on top of the water. And if you're not careful, and if we're not careful, as we rethink what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and as we go through what sometimes people call deconstruction, we can end up adopting a version of Christianity that is a subversion, an aberrant version, or even a heretical version. Or we can just deconstruct right out of the Christian faith and have no Christian faith at the end of it. And so tonight, if you are in the process of deconstructing your faith, and I'll define that in a minute, or you know someone who is, and you're dialoguing with that person, I hope that these 2 things will help you as you go through that process. So here we go. Let's jump right into it. When I use the word deconstruction, many people use it differently, but I'm going to define it like this, that people who are going through a process of faith deconstruction are people who have come to a crisis in their faith, and they're now asking questions about it. Mostly they're Christians who have been Christians for a significant period of time, probably raised in the church, and something happens, and they ask one of 2 questions. And the first question is this: is Jesus really the way? You know, I have been born into this faith, and I haven't thought about it much. I have received it, but I haven't really thought myself into it. And now I'm wondering whether or not it's even true. And so I'm going to deconstruct it. I'm going to take it apart, put it all on the table, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Sometimes when people do that, they come back to faith with a much stronger conviction. But sometimes when people do that, they end up walking away from faith, and they say, you know, I adopted this, but it wasn't really mine, and now that I've thought about it, I don't believe it anymore. The second question is not, is Jesus the way? The second question is, what is the way of Jesus? People who are asking that question are saying, hey, I've been raised as a Christian, but I'm not really quite sure that the Christian faith or the version or the take of Christianity that I have inherited really reflects what I think the way of Jesus really should look like. And there's a lot of young people who are disillusioned and who are frustrated because they see maybe some bad examples of people who claim to be followers of Jesus. Or maybe they think that the church has become too involved in politics. Or whatever it is, whatever the issue is, they start to say, I know that Jesus is the way, but I don't know what the way of Jesus looks like anymore. And so now I'm going to take apart the faith that I have. I'm going to place all the beliefs on the table, and then I'm going to rethink them. Now, here is a really crucial point in that process. When the rethinking happens, What is the faith being built according to? What is the reconstruction? What's the blueprint? What's going to be the authority? Because if it's going to be the Word of God, then you have a really good chance of having a robust faith that may be even more biblical and faithful than the one you inherited. But if it's going to be a process by which you say, I will only accept the pieces that align with my values, then we run the risk of creating God and Christianity in our own image. So, let's talk about social imaginaries. This is the cultural piece. David Foster Wallace, who was an American novelist, was speaking at Kenyon College in 2005. He was giving the graduation speech, and he started off by telling a story of two young fish who were swimming along, and they came across an older fish, and the older fish looked at them and said, "Hey boys, how's the water today?" And they just nodded, and then they kept swimming, and then one looked at the other, and they said, "What's water?" When you're in an environment, and it's the very basis for your existence, you're probably not aware of it. There's a Chinese parable that says if you want to know what the water's like, don't ask the fish. That's because they don't realize that they're in the water. And yet the water is shaping them and is the very basis for their existence. Analogously, we're all immersed in something that sociologists and philosophers call a social imaginary. It's a really clumsy term because it's actually grammatically not even correct, right? A social imaginary is a bit like a worldview, except worldviews are cognitive. We think about them. We evaluate them. They say, where did I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? Why is the world broken, and what's the solution to that? And we might go through different options and offerings as far as answers to those questions go. And there's lots of different worldviews out there that are on hand to do that. But a social imaginary is something that's much more subtle. It's not something that we're aware of and that we think about. It's actually kind of how we think, or it's what we think with when we engage the world. In fact, it's not even how we think, it's mostly how we feel about the world. It's kind of, if worldviews are the product of our head, a social imaginary is the product of your stomach, right? Your gut. It's how we just imagine that the world should be. So a social imaginary is something that people all share at a given time and in a given place. They're unspoken assumptions about the nature of the world. They shape our intuitions, our values, and our moral sensibilities. And finally, they're instilled unconsciously in us through our environment. They're like the operating software that runs in the background of your computer that you're not aware of, but yet it is the very basis for your computer to operate. They're kind of like particulate matter, the little tiny particles that are in the air that we don't see, that we don't even have any sense of, and yet we're breathing them in and breathing them out all the time, and they affect us. They're like it's like dark matter. It's that part of the universe that's really out there, but no one really knows much about it, but it's still there. A social imaginary is that part of our being that engages the world and causes us to quickly think yes or no, right or wrong, good or bad about a lot of the things that we encounter and that we come across. Now, the social imaginary that we live in is sometimes called the age of authenticity. The age of authenticity. But to get a better handle on that, I want to start off by contrasting the age of authenticity with the age of obligation. That's a term that Sean McDowell and I use in our book, Set Adrift, where we talk about deconstructing your faith without actually sinking it. The age of obligation is somewhere between the late 1800s and the early beginnings of the 1960s. And when you think about the age of obligation, you should think about the people that Tom Brokaw wrote about in his book, The Greatest Generation. The greatest generation, Tom Brokaw says, is the generation that lived through the Depression, that went and fought the Nazis, and then came back home and built the greatest economy that the world has ever seen. And he says the reason why they did that was their values. And their values were service, duty, responsibility, and honor. Now, all of those are things that you have towards something else, something greater than you, something bigger than you. We don't necessarily have those towards ourselves. So in the age of obligation, it wasn't the draft that sent most of these guys to war. It was a sense of obligation that they had. And here's why. Because they believed that there was an objective nature to reality beyond what you could see. They believed there were real moral truths. They believed that there were moral facts. They believed that there were general principles of reality that existed outside and beyond the physical world. And because of that, they thought that the United States in general, probably even sort of a Judeo-Christian background, had mapped that fairly well. And therefore, they had a responsibility and a duty to take up their role in the story for something greater and bigger than themselves. And so they went off to war. The beginning of the 1960s is when the age of obligation comes to an end. And we won't take all the time to go into that, but I think we're all familiar enough with it to realize that in the 1960s, America goes through one of the greatest upheavals in its history. Part of that upheaval is a great suspicion that there are really any objective, true stories about the world. That everyone has their own perspective, that everyone has their own view on things, that institutions like the church or the government or the university really are just placing on individuals their own social construction, their own story about reality in order to control them. But pluralism, the idea that there are different ways of thinking about things, becomes a much more significant force in the United States, and young people look around and say, but not everybody agrees on all of these issues. Lots of people think X, lots of people think Y, and a lot of people think, I have to think about this because I'm in America, Z. If it's a different audience, it would be Z, right? So you have this hinge period in American history. And the values that were important to the greatest generation become less important to the generation of the 1960s. And duty, honor, responsibility, and faith become more directed towards oneself. Because there probably aren't any really true big stories about objective nature of reality. And if that's the case, why should I submit myself and go off to fight the war in Vietnam? For what? For the government? And that leads us to the age of authenticity, where we're at today. Right? The age of authenticity is the age where there is a tremendous amount of skepticism to the fact that there could be an objective reality out there of metaphysical truths that are just beyond the physical ones that we see. That there really are moral truths and moral facts. That there really is a true definition for what it means to be male or female, or what it means to be a family, or what marriage is. All of these things, the argument would go is that, look, there's lots of different ways that people engage the world underneath those definitions. So who's to say that this view is right, or that view is right, or that view is right? Everyone disagrees. In fact, probably no views are right because there probably aren't any real moral objective facts out there at all. In fact, everything really is a social construction. If everything really is a social construction, if everything just is really a collective hunch, if the stories that we're being told aren't really stories that reflect reality, but are really being told by powerful people in order to keep their power, then why should I feel any obligation? Why should I feel any duty to fulfill the roles in their stories that don't really reflect reality whatsoever? In fact, the only obligation I have and the only moral duty I have is to myself, to be authentically who I am. And so we move from the age of obligation through the hinge period of the 60s to the age of authenticity, where the highest value that almost anyone can have is to be authentic and be true to themselves. So here's a comparison. In the age of obligation, there really was a belief that there was an objective structure to reality. There was truth out there to be found. That structure was knowable, not absolutely certain, but at least we thought that we were in touch with it and that we could make true statements about things that were beyond the scientific. We actually thought to some degree that we had generally kind of mapped it in the West, that there was real truth, that freedom was something important, that capitalism really was a good way of doing things, that democracy, as Winston Churchill said, was the worst form of governance that you could think of unless you consider all of the other forms that are out there, then it actually becomes the best, he says. We thought that our view of the world is correct for everyone in the age of obligation. This is why we actually went over and fought, because they thought that there was bad things happening that were objectively bad. I had a discussion with a gentleman who was deeply involved at the highest levels in the Pentagon in giving George W. Bush the legal go-ahead to pull the trigger on Saddam Hussein and invade Iraq back in Desert Storm. And I said to him, do you think that there are true moral facts, real moral principles out there? Or is it all just social construction? And he said, of course there has to be real moral facts, because if there aren't, then all we could say was what Saddam Hussein was doing was displeasing to us and distasteful to us, but we couldn't say that he was doing anything wrong, because if there's not real moral truths and real moral values, then what was he doing? Nothing. He wasn't doing anything bad. He was just doing what he liked to do, and we didn't like it. So yes, he says, there really are moral truths and moral facts to be found out there, and they're true for everybody. In the age of obligation, we're all obligated to play out our part for the greater good. You really do have a responsibility. And it's not to yourself primarily, but it's for others. But not in the age of authenticity. Right? In the age of authenticity, and this might be the most important point, there is no objective structure to reality. The answer that if the general that I was speaking to, if he was a sort of coming out of the age of authenticity, he would say, well, there really aren't any true moral facts, and what Saddam Hussein was doing really wasn't objectively wrong, but certainly we didn't like it, and so that's why we did it. Because in the age of authenticity, that's what you have, no structure. There's no metaphysical truths. There actually isn't anything to be known out there, and which means that all of the claims about this is the way that things are, and this is the definition of a gender, and this is the definition of sexuality, that's all just a group of people who sort of believe the same things. And if you don't believe that and you're not part of their group, why should you conform to their view? No one ultimately has the correct view of reality, so then why should I conform to the requirements of a social construct? In fact, I only live once. And if there really are no deeper truths out there, and I have no real obligations to anything greater and higher than myself, because it's all just a collective hunch, then why shouldn't I just live the way that I want to live and be authentically who I am? This is Charles Taylor. He's a Canadian philosopher. He wrote a massive book called The Secular Age. He sort of coins the term the age of authenticity. And he says each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, right? It's very individualistic, it's very unique. And that it's important to find out and live out one's own, as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside, by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. That's what he says characterizes the age that we live in, the age of authenticity. One of the key virtues of the age of authenticity, then, is expressing your own individuality. In a recent book that came out that I think is really fantastic and can really help explain why we're at where we're at when it comes to the significant drop in people who identify as Christians, is this book by Christian Smith, who's a sociologist at Notre Dame, and he talks about expressive individualism, which is the fruit of the age of authenticity. And he says, individuals possess a unique inner self that needs to be discovered and authentically expressed, one that external authorities threaten to compromise, and that, to realize authenticity, individuals have to trust their subjective feelings and personal experiences as the final authority. Right? So we live in a world, sometimes called a postmodern world, where truth is relative, and if that's the case, that means all stories are just power plays by people telling you how to live and how to behave and defining all the terms for you. And if that's not true, then the only thing you have as an obligation is to free yourself from that and live according to who you are. And we hear this all the time. Justin Bieber was being interviewed a few years ago, and he was talking about his faith, and he said, I don't want to start preaching. And the gentleman who was interviewing him from Rolling Stone magazine said, no, speak your truth. Right? Speak your truth. That was never a phrase that you would say, hey, that's true for you, and that's true for you, which is sort of just a shorthand for saying you really believe this and you really believe the opposite. But no one ever would have said, speak your truth, as though truth is something that is so idiosyncratic that each person has their own. We hear things like, you do you only live once. And so, in the age of authenticity, you are unapologetically called to live your life. And if what makes you unique is not your body, because everyone's got one of those. It's not even necessarily your history, because everyone has somewhat of a history that they share with lots of other people. But what makes you unique is your inner feelings, your sense of identity, how you perceive yourself. And that becomes the arbiter. That becomes the final criterion as to whether or not you're living authentically, is if you're living in line with that. And so if I'm going to live my life, and I'm going to be authentic, and I'm going to do what I want, I'm going to live the way that I want, not according to anybody else's narrative or story, then what follows is that I have to be tolerant and let everyone else do the exact same thing. The greatest virtue in the age of authenticity is tolerance. And the greatest vice, of course, is intolerance, right? We need to let people live how they want to live. Now, we see this all the time, and let me bring sort of maybe to our conscious awareness how this gets played out and how we're getting shaped and squeezed and molded into this way of thinking about ourselves. The hero's journey used to be that a hero, an individual, would strike out for the greater good of a community and try and overcome an obstacle that was a threat to the community, and it might be at a great sacrifice to themselves, maybe even their own life. And they would have been looked at and lauded as someone who was selfless, who put other people before themselves, even willing to sacrifice their life unto the death. Do you know what the hero's journey is now? The hero's journey is when a young person in a movie is told, this is who you are and this is where you fit, and they say, no, that's not who I am. This is really who I am. I will be authentically me. They throw off the shackles of expectation. The movie reaches a crescendo where there's a point where they don't back down, and at the end, everyone agrees, you really were right. This is who you are. You've taught us something. And you know where you'll find that movie, that theme? In every movie that comes out, in every Pixar movie, and in every Disney movie for kids. This is the script that all young people are being given, and all young people are being taught about how to think about themselves. Just think about High School Musical to begin with. I have a daughter, right? In the High School Musical, the two heroes are a boy and a girl. The girl is a math genius, and the boy is a basketball player. And they have great expectations placed upon them by their families and their friends and their teammates and their club, the people in their club, the club members. But you know what they really want to do? They really want to sing. It's really hard for me to believe that Zac Efron is the same guy who played Carrie Von Erich in that wrestling movie and was also twirling and dancing and out in a field in High School Musical, right? But their friends get really upset, and they say, no, we got to be who we really got to be. We have to do be who we really are. And at the end of the movie, everyone comes together and they have a big dance-off, and it's all wonderful and great, and they're looked at as the hero. And you know what? We were all wrong. You being the rebel is right. They're right. Same thing with Inside Out. Same thing with Moana. Frozen. Greatest Showman. Turning Red. Watch the first 5 minutes of Turning Red. I was going to put it in here, but for the sake of time, I didn't. But the first 5 minutes, she says, hi, my name is Mei Ling Lee, and I'm 13 years old. I come from a family where you have to honor your family a lot. Some people say, though, if you honor your family too much, you might forget to honor yourself. That's not my problem. Ever since I turned 13, I do what I want, I go where I want, I live how I want. If I want to do a cartwheel on the street, I do a cartwheel on the street. And then she goes on listing all of the things that she can do because she's Mei Ling Lee, and she will not be put in any category or any box. Almost every young person movie that comes out, every tween movie, is based on the same script. I bet if I were to ask you, you could probably think of movies right now that follow this exact same storyline. And what is it telling you? It's telling you that there's no ultimate, real big truth out there that you need to conform your life to. You need to be who you are. You need to be free. So when we talk about deconstruction, this process or this trend where people say, I have a real bee in my bonnet here about some of these things that I've inherited in my Christian faith. And I'm not really sure this lines up with how I see the world and what I think is good and what I think is valuable. don't think it lines up with my values. What's happening here is that the age of authenticity is the engine that's driving the train of deconstruction. Right? The age of authenticity actually instills in us, squeezes us without our awareness into thinking a particular kind of way. Victor Hugo, in his book, The Man Who Laughs, talks about this group of people who were called the Campesinos, who used to go and take small children off the streets, and they would bring these very small children and put them in pots, and the vases were different shapes, and they would let the child's head come out the top, and the legs come out the bottom, and the arms come out the side, and then they would feed them, and they would leave them in there for long periods of time, maybe several years, and they would lay them down at night so they could go to sleep, and then they'd stand them up in the mornings. But eventually, as you can imagine, as the child grew, their body took on the shape of the vase. And at some point, when they could no longer stay in the vase, they would crack the vase open, and these little deformed monster children would come out for the entertainment of people. Those kids, those children, knew they were being shaped and squeezed into a particular kind of shape. There was no question about it. But we're all being shaped and squeezed into a way of thinking about ourselves, our responsibilities, the world, our relationship to God, our relationship to the Bible, our relationship to one another. I'm just not so sure we're aware of it because it's our social imaginary. It works underneath our worldview. It's the way we just imagine and we think about the world before we ever actually engage it. The age of authenticity actually instills in us then this reflex to deconstruct. You can imagine if you have been watching all of those Disney movies all of your life and those Pixar movies, and it's really deep inside of you, and you go to church on Sunday morning and you hear something from the Word of God and you say, I'm not really quite sure that aligns with my values. I'm not really quite sure that I feel that is authentically who I am, and I can affirm that. That is a reflex action. And we are developing an entire generation of young people who are saying, okay, you've handed me Christianity. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take it, put it on the table, I'm going to take it apart piece by piece, and then I'm going to reassemble it according to what feels authentic to me and my values. I think probably anybody here over 45 or 50 probably went through something similar, but here's the big difference. When I was presented with the gospel, when I was presented with the claims of Jesus, my options were, at least in my mind, I accept it or I reject it. But there was no third option. There was no third middle way where I said, well, I'll evaluate it and see if it lines up with how I feel. See if it lines up with my values. And the parts that don't, I will just feel free to set aside. But that's what happens in our social imaginary. It tells us to only accept versions of the faith that align with our values. So what's the relationship then between personal values and deconstruction, right? So that's the first part. Know your culture. Your culture is one that is the age of authenticity, that is pushing you to express your individualism because there really is no bigger truth out there, so you do you. There's a relationship, though, between the personal values that we have and deconstruction as well. So psychologists tell us that we know what before we know why in many, many cases. What I mean by that is we know what we believe before we know why we believe it. We form beliefs really quickly. Some of you have seen the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. In that book, he talks about thinking fast, talks about intuition, this cognitive ability that we have to form a belief really quickly without having to go through a long process of reasoning like we would, say, doing a math equation or evaluating maybe evidence in a trial. If I look at you and you have kind of a grumpy face, I don't have to think, oh, maybe I've said something annoying to them. I immediately form that belief because there's something self-evident and clear to me. That's what psychologists mean when we say we know what often before we know why. Here's an example of that. If I tell you that this is a husband and a wife, I know she's not wearing a ring, I could have got a better picture, but there's a husband and a wife, and they're passionately kissing. And he's drying her hair or something like that. And I say to you, is that good? Is that okay? You say, yeah, not only is that okay, that's actually good for married people to do. And I say, why? And you can come up with some reasons for that. But then if I say, all right, they're not husband and wife, they're twin brother and sister. Did you even have to think? Of course not. Now, if I said to you, why is that wrong? It's hard to explain, right? You might be able to give a reason if you had enough time to think about it. But then if I said, well, why is that wrong? We would go through the process, and you know where you would eventually bottom out? You would not bottom out at an intellectual reason. You would bottom out at a value that you think is being violated in this example. Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist, moral psychologist at New York University. You have one of his books out here in the lobby. You probably have heard his name before. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And in The Righteous Mind, he says that we form beliefs about moral issues, religious issues, meaning of life issues, political issues really, really quickly without thinking about them based on the values that we hold deep inside. If I say to you, genocide, you all say, oh, that's bad. If I say, torturing babies, you don't have to think about it. You say, that's bad. If I say the University of Michigan is the greatest football program in the history of the United States, you say, get out of my church and never come back. He argues very persuasively he's interviewed tens of thousands of people, that intuitions come first, strategic reasoning comes second when it comes to moral issues. So let's think of a belief that we might have. And let's take, this is controversial, but this is not political. Let's just take the border wall for a second, okay? If I say border wall, that we should build a border wall, some of you immediately will say, mm-mm. Some of you immediately will say, that's right, we should. If I ask you why, we will end up bottoming out at two different values. So beliefs are like a destination. How do you get to the destination? Your intuition brings you there. Same way that I see an angry-looking face, I conclude, oh, they're upset. I say border wall, you say yes, you say no. What brought you there? Your intuition. That's right, it makes sense. No, that's right, it does not make sense. That's a good thing. No, it's a bad thing. But people come to different conclusions on moral issues. Everybody comes to the same conclusion when they see an angry face or a happy face. But why do we come to different conclusions on moral issues, political issues, religious issues? It's because if the belief that we have is the destination, and the thing that gets us to the destination, that drives us there, is our intuition that's quickly triggered. It's our values that are driving the car. It's the values that drive the car. And some people give greater weight to different values. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt talks about what he calls his moral foundations theory. Many of us know that you have 6 taste receptors on your tongue: sweet, savory, salty. I don't remember what the rest of them all are, but we all share them. But not everyone loves salty things, not everyone likes spicy things, not everyone loves sweet things. We all are at different places. We all give different preference to different kinds of foods based on the taste receptors that we have. That's an analogy, he says, for human beings' moral foundation. Everyone, he says, has a moral foundation that most of their reasoning will go back to when it comes to ethical issues, political issues, or religious issues. And he says they always come in pairs. He says everyone that he's ever interviewed holds these 6 value-vice pairings. Value number 1, everyone agrees that you should be caring. That's a virtue. Doing harm is a vice. You shouldn't do that. Everyone believes that you should be fair, and everyone also agrees that cheating is wrong. That you should be loyal, and that betraying other people is a bad thing. That authority generally is good, and subverting authority is bad. There are things that are pure and good and righteous, and then there are things that are degrading and impure. And then lastly, that liberty is better than oppression. Everyone, he says, holds these worldwide. It's just part of our wiring as a human being. But the problem is, when we disagree, it's because the values that we give greater weight to trigger our intuitions differently, and they form different beliefs in us. Again, go back to the border wall. For some of you, the border wall, if you say yes, I'll tell you probably why. Your reasoning will bottom out somewhere, probably around authority is very important for you, and you really value authority, rightfully used. You also may value loyalty, that, hey, we need to take care of the people who are in our country before we let other people come into our country. You could even have a view of purity, as in like, this is the United States, these are other countries. We can't just not have a border and a border wall because then we don't have a country anymore. But if you say no border wall, it's probably because you say, hey, these are people. They need help. They're running from terrible situations often. We need to care for them, and putting up that border wall will harm them. Or maybe you say something along the lines of, hey, fairness is really important, and these people didn't have a shot in life the same way that we did, so we can't keep them out. But maybe the most important one is that for you will be the liberty one, where having people be free is far more important, and you give greater weight to. And so in these kinds of discussions, it's our gut, or maybe our heart, that informs our head, and this is why we come to different conclusions. So the question then is, where do we get our values? We get them from in some ways, probably biology, but in other ways, our family. But now let's tie everything back into the age of authenticity. In the age of authenticity, we're heavily influenced by modern moral sensibilities, right? Our social imaginary. In the age of authenticity, there are no authoritative stories about the world that demand our allegiance. It's all a social construct. Living by another's authority means not being who you are. Therefore, the age of authenticity tends to elevate and instill in us the following values. See if you can guess which ones they are. Here's one. If there's no ultimate story, if there's no ultimate right or wrong, then how can you ever do anything that would cause someone harm in any kind of a way? How about fairness? Or liberty? All six of these are very important. We hold all six of them. But when we only focus on, or when we only give weight to certain ones, they will cause us to see and read the Bible differently. This goes for those who would fall more on the right and those who would fall also on the left. Here's an example. If you deeply feel the values that the age of authenticity promotes, care, which is good, but not to the exclusion of the others, liberty, which is good, but not to the exclusion of the others, and fairness, which is good, but not to the exclusion of the others, then what happens when you come across divine judgment in the Bible? That feels really unkind. And your intuitions get triggered, and it forms the belief, I'm not really sure that I can buy this. What about Christian exclusivism? That Jesus is the only way? That feels very oppressive. Because what about all the people who have never heard about Jesus? And who are we to say that we're right? Divine violence feels unjustifiable. Because that violates, how could God, who loves people and cares for people, ever do anything that we might understand as being harmful to people? The Bible places external limits on who we are. It tells us to take up our cross. It tells us to conform our life to Jesus. It tells us to do stuff with our money and our bodies and our minds. The New Testament is filled with all kinds of encouragement and commands from the Apostle Paul from Peter and from others. But yet, that doesn't seem very free in the age of authenticity. And finally, maybe one of the most significant of all, and this is hard for young people. I also teach high school, which didn't get mentioned earlier. We teach a unit on sexual ethics, and I teach all of the seniors. I hold to a traditional Christian historic sexual ethic. One man, one woman is the only place where sexual activity is acceptable and ordained by God. But you know how hard it is for me to look out at that crowd of kids when I know that there are kids in there who identify as transgender, who identify as non-binary, who identify as queer, and have to tell them, this is what the Bible says. That is hard. And I'm 52 years old. How much harder is it for young people who have been raised in the age of authenticity and who have been instilled with values of care and of freedom and of tolerance to be able to say, hey, I love you, but the Bible calls this activity sin. The other side of the coin is true too, right? If you're someone who's given to some of the more, maybe we could call them conservative values of elevating loyalty and authority, it can be really easy for us to maybe place greater value on those and miss some of the other passages that talk about care and kindness and love and grace. I saw an example of this several years ago. I met a young man, this is not him, at a church. It was a high school youth event, and it was Christmas time, so I went and gave a Christmas message, and he came up to me afterwards, and he said, hey, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure, what do you want to talk about? I thought you want to talk to me about Christmas, and if Jesus was really born on December 25th, like something really easy, you know? And he said, so what do you think about gay marriage? So I did what any good politician would do, and I said, well, why don't you tell me, what do you think about gay marriage? It's always helpful to do because you want to be gracious and kind and understand where someone's coming from before you answer them. And what he said to me was fascinating to me. He said, you know what? He pointed to his head. Up here, I think it's wrong. But then he did this. But down here, I don't feel like it is. That's because what's out there in the world, the values that we're swimming in, our social imaginary, instills in us what we feel in here. And what we feel in here, eventually, we believe up here. And I fear that unless that young man had someone who came along and had good conversations with him, and that he was involved in a sort of a counter formation group, which is just a fancy way of saying he stuck around church and got into his youth group and was influenced by people who love Jesus and hold fast to his word, that what he felt down here will eventually cause him to believe the same up there. Because when it comes to a lot of these issues, that's exactly how we work. It is almost always the gut informing the head, which is why often discussions on these issues never go anywhere, because we're always arguing over reasons up here when what we really need to do is sort of find out what is the driving value that we don't share down here and discuss that. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. All of this then can bring about this, that in the name of deconstruction, we can look for ways of interpreting Christianity that are more in line with the spirit of the age or than with the historic understanding of our faith. Now, I have progressivechristianity.org up there. I put that up there on purpose for two reasons. One, because this would be a very good example of a group who has set the Bible aside and is now reconstructing Christianity according to their own way of, their own values, their own beliefs, and their own way of thinking. But also to say this, that not everyone who identifies as someone who would consider themselves a progressive Christian falls into this category. The term progressive Christianity means lots of different things to lots of different people, and I really want to be careful in talking about and in using that term to say that not everyone and not every church who identifies as being somewhat progressive is heretical or has some aberrant form of Christian faith. Some for sure do. But some are just people who say, you know what, I'm into caring for the poor and the homeless, and I never saw that in my church, and so I'm progressive in that regard. So what I'm not saying this, that rethinking what you believe is wrong. In fact, I think that we should rethink what we believe. We should always be reforming, right? We should always be asking ourselves, do my beliefs line up with what the Bible has to say? I'm not saying that reevaluating the version of Christianity that you inherit is a bad thing. In fact, you may need to evaluate the version of Christianity that you inherited. I talked to lots of people who once identified as Christians and no longer do, and so many of them have the same story in common, that they came from a Christian faith that was so rigid and inflexible, it was built like a house of cards, and every belief was elevated to a non-negotiable, and when one card got pulled out of their house of faith cards, the entire edifice collapsed and hit the ground. It would have been really helpful for them at some point if they would have reevaluated their faith, because some of the aspects of their faith really were toxic. Rethinking and reevaluating the version of Christianity that you've inherited is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's done in a reconstructive way that uses the Word of God as a blueprint. I'm not saying that there's only one way to faithfully interpret the Bible. One of the things that Sean and I argue in the book Set Adrift is that the Christian shoreline is long and it is broad, and there are lots of communities that dot the shoreline of the Christian faith that are well within the Orthodox historic understanding of Christianity. And if the one that you were raised in and the one that you fit in doesn't align and doesn't fit in a way where you feel like this is home for me, there are other places out there. Lots of times people who leave the faith think that the version of Christianity that they were given is just pure, unadulterated Christianity without any accretions whatsoever. They're completely unaware that there are other ways within the historic Orthodox understanding of the faith with a high view of Scripture within the creeds of being a Christian than the one that they were raised in. I'm not saying that some version of fundamentalism is right either. Sometimes people who read the book say, oh yeah, you guys sound nice, but really what you're trying to do is just get people to stick around and be some sort of rabid fundamentalist. There are problems there too. And lastly, that every Christian or church that identifies as progressive is bad. Yes, some do. But progressive is similar to evangelical in that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I read one study that said that the thing that most people who identify as evangelical today have in common, it used to be church attendance. You know what it is now? Who they vote for. So there are Mormons, Muslims, and others who identify as evangelical. Why? Because they all vote in the same block as evangelical Christians do. Right? So I really want to be careful. But I am concerned, and we wrote the book because we have a lot of Biola students who say to us, can we talk? What do you want to talk about? I'm deconstructing. What does that mean? And we're really concerned because some of them have deconstructed into versions of the faith that are not recognizable as being faithfully biblical, and some have just left. So here are the takeaways. Number one, values really are often the root cause of driving deconversion and deconstruction. They are like the hidden part of the iceberg that's under the water that you don't see. And many times in a conversation with someone you're talking to who might be deconstructing, they say, or I'm in the process of even deconverting, and you ask why, it's really helpful to remember that maybe what is happening that even is off the radar of their conscious awareness, that it's underneath the hood, is that they have been squeezed and shaped into a mold. Lots of people think that they're being trendy by deconstructing, when in one sense, they're really just becoming products of the age. And so we want to be able to raise that to their conscious awareness. Also reminding perhaps them that, look, do you realize that no one really in the history of the church ever deconstructed in the way that you're doing? Privately by yourself, seeing what aligns with your values and your beliefs. No one in the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s, did people rethink what they believed? Yes, but not in the way that you're doing it. This is new, this is a result, and you are the fruit of the age of authenticity. And values always influence our interpretation and our reading of Scripture. And it's always helpful to remember that, because there's lots of things in the Bible that I wish I could read out of the Bible. There are lots of things that go against the grain and that I don't like in there. I wish that there were things that weren't true that Jesus said, to be quite honest with you. Now, I know that that's irrational, and I know that Jesus is right, but it really steps on my toes and goes against my grain. And so I have to be really careful when my intuition gets pinged and I say, does that really mean that? I got to say, what's triggering that? And am I feeling this way because something's really there and my interpretation is off? Or is it just the desires of my heart welling up and trying to find a way around it? And so, know yourself, know your culture, as you rethink faith, as you investigate what you believe, but make sure as you do, you keep aware and keep in mind that you are a product of a culture that is pushing you and squeezing you into this mold, and you will be tempted to follow along, and that it is trying to instill in you values that will oftentimes cause the Word of God to be in unalignment with what you feel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. We'll get a chair and table up here for you. Well, we've got a lot of questions. If you'll spend some time engaging with those, we'd appreciate it. Like I said, I read your book and thought it was great. You used the kissing siblings example a lot. That was the only thing that got me.
That was Sean McDowell. McDowell.
Okay. Blame your co-author. No, really good. Like I said, lots of questions, so we'll just hop right in. Let's talk a little bit about the ages that you mentioned. Several people asking about that, and starting with the age of obligation. Would you say that that was an age that was maybe more conducive to the gospel and biblical Christianity, or did it just have its own set of issues? Just talk a little bit about that age and what you saw as it relates to biblical Christianity.
Sure, that's a great question. I think there's two things that are helpful in answering that. One, I think that we're always operating on two levels, whether it's thinking about the 1950s and how many people went to church, and thinking about the 1950s and thinking about how many people really had a relationship with Jesus, were truly born again, and were his disciples. Because I think that there are a lot of people now who would say, yeah, I don't go to church, I was a Christian, I'm no longer one. The question is, were they truly born again and saved in the past? And had they lived back in the 1950s, would they have just continued on identifying as a Christian because there was no other options for them? That's just what everybody did, and that's where everyone was. So I think certainly in the age of obligation, you have a plausibility structure that has been eroded in our day. A plausibility structure is when there's enough people in a group that you recognize and respect and are a part of, that makes a particular belief reasonable for you to hold on to. And when you have the majority of people in the United States, even back as far as the 1970s, about 90% of Americans identified as Christians. About 5% of those identified as having no religious faith. Today, it's about 65% identify as Christians, and about 30% identify as having no religious faith. So if you are in an environment where there's lots of people who hold the same beliefs as you, then it's a lot easier to hold on to those beliefs. If you're in an environment where there's very few people, the plausibility structure is eroded, and you'll start to have much more questions. So I think that it was more conducive to at least be Christian in either a nominal sense or as a genuine believer in the age of obligation than it would have been in the age of than it is in the age of authenticity.
So talk a little bit about the age of authenticity and how you view that in the sense of, is it a net negative, positive, or neutral? And do you think that there are some unique actual opportunities when it comes to presenting the gospel?
Yeah, good question. I think sometimes what happens, and I'm really glad that this question was asked, because it can sound like when I give a presentation like this that everything was great about the age of authenticity and everything was great about the age of obligation, and everything's really bad about the age of authenticity. That's not the case either. So, for example, there were lots of very rigid roles. There were lots of very clear-cut lines and boxes that people would have been put in the age of obligation, and there was a much less opportunity for someone to be who they were or to express who they were. I think of women whose roles were expected to be in the home, and they were to bear children, and they were to cook and clean, and that was it. That was the sum total of what they could do. Where now we say, that seems kind of restrictive. Like there's lots more opportunities for women, I think, underneath the understanding of the Word of God than there would have been in the age of obligation. So I do think that there is some positives to the age of authenticity. And I think that, young people today are more accepting, they're more in a way gracious, more tolerant of people than certainly when I was younger. I think that that's a positive thing too. I think that there is something to recognizing that you can love someone and you can like someone, you can be friends with someone, but you don't have to agree with them. But I think that, growing up for me in the late 70s and in the mid 80s, I would have had a really hard time being friends with or accepting or thinking this person was even okay to associate with because we don't believe the exact same things. So I do think that there are some really positive, healthy things.
Anything when it comes to planting seeds for the gospel in the age of authenticity that you think is a positive?
Yeah, I think Gavin is going to speak tomorrow, or I think it's tomorrow. Is today the first day of the conference?
It is.
Okay, so Gavin's going to speak tomorrow on the beauty of apologetics, and I think that is a really timely discussion to have because, most of the young people who I engage with who have left their faith, very few of them say things like, there's no evidence for the existence of God, and the whole resurrection argument fails. It's almost all experience, values, and so an apologetic that can paint the person of Jesus as beautiful and as good and as a longing of the heart's desire, and also one that says, hey, biblical faith is not necessarily being certain. Biblical faith is acting on a hope that you have enough reasons to do so for, right? So biblical faith is acting on a hope that you have sufficient reasons for. And when I tell that to my high school students, they seem kind of surprised because they all think that being a Christian means being a believer, and a believer, you're a better believer the more confident you are. But if I emphasize to them, being a Christian is a combination of believing and also living, you don't need to be absolutely certain to be able to take up your role in the story. In fact, some days your confidence that the story is true will be really high, and then some days your confidence that the story is true might dip. But as long as it stays above a line that says, I'm inclined to think that this is true and that the evidence for it is more likely than not, then you can rationally and with a clear conscience continue to live out the story. And in fact, you might be a great believer with a great amount of faith, even though sometimes you don't have a great amount of confidence. And I think that's helpful for young people to hear.
A lot of questions about if the water we're swimming in is actually starting to change. Are we moving out of an age of authenticity? And we actually started to hit on this in our last Q&A, talking about Gen Z and young men actually starting to come to the faith in large numbers and maybe being tired of the relativism in the age of authenticity. Are you seeing any shifts like that in the people that you work with or in your research?
No, I'm aware of the data that says that, if you look at it, since the 1990s, Christianity has just been in a free fall in the United States, and being a nun or being secular has been on the rise. In the last few years, though, there has been a plateau in the decline in Christianity. I think it's too early to be able to say whether or not that is an aberration, whether or not it's actually going to be a plateau, or whether it's going to continue to drop. I suspect that it will plateau and then sort of glacially continue to creep down over time, I think for the following reasons. One, because Ryan Burge in his book, The Rise of the Nuns, talks about how the vast majority of people who now identify as a nun at one point did identify as religious and as specifically as Christian. So from the 1990s until today, you have this incredible drop-off. Those are nuns who were made. They were made nuns. They once were Christians. They said, no, I reject that. I'm not religious anymore. I have no religious faith. But when you look at the data, what you find is that every cohort or every generation following the one before, their religious commitment drops. So you have the silent generation, you have the greatest generation, you have the boomers, you have Gen X, you have millennials, then you have Gen Z, and then you have Alpha. So Gen Z is the replacement generation for those older generations. When you look at the data, what you find is only about 5% of the boomer generation identified as a nun. At least 22% right now of Alpha identify as a nun, and 46% of Gen Z identify as a nun. So all that to say that, yes, it does look like the free fall may have stopped because nuns aren't being made, but what's happening is nuns are being born. They're being raised in homes by parents who have no religious faith. And so that's why I think you will not see a continual drop. I think that's probably coming to an end, but I think that over time you will continue to see religious faith in the United States continue to decline.
Yeah, you talk in Set Adrift about finding, a faith community that essentially fits your values and follows God the way you want to follow God. We have a question about the idea of church shopping. We also want to be rooted and planted in community and not hop at the first sign of trouble. Mm-hmm. How do we balance those as believers who want to be planted as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it also raises the issue of another balance that I just will say first, is that one of the things we wanted to say in the book was that you should not just follow and adopt a Christianity that aligns with your values. But we also wanted to say, hey, look, maybe you really are someone who deeply cares about social issues and being involved for Jesus in the world, and that's not where your church is at. Then it's okay to find a church that emphasizes those things. What we're trying not to say is, we're sort of walking the fine line of saying, the age of authenticity says that you should follow your values and follow your heart. Don't do that. But when it comes to picking a church, you can do that. Like, that's what we're trying to avoid saying. So what we want to say is that, yeah, be careful and avoid the first issue, but there is a space. You are not your parents. You are not your grandparents. You have inherited a faith and a faith community. And perhaps it's not one that you fit in the best. There might be a really great Christian community and a great Christian church where you can get involved and you can really plug in. What was the second part of that?
I think that was it.
That was it?
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and on this one, you also talk in your book about this duty to conform, how we have a duty as Christians to not just follow our feelings and desires, but to conform them to truth, right? This duty to conform to truth. How do we pass along that duty to those that we are teaching and influencing so that they can withstand deconstruction?
I think part of it is educating and bringing to awareness the fact that we really do live in these social environments that are always squeezing us into the mold. And I think that's why Paul says back in Romans, I probably don't even have to quote it because you're all thinking of it right now, where he says, don't be conformed to the world, which really is don't be conformed to the present spirit of the age, how it manifests in your world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so I think what we need to do is we really do need to raise to awareness what the threats are, what the squeezing is, what the environment is that we're in, and then I think we need to say, now look, here is what God calls us to. Here are the lenses that we should be seeing the world through, and those are the lenses of both Scripture and spiritual disciplines, both pointing to Jesus.
Well, thank you so much for raising our awareness tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank
Let's
you.
hear it again for John Marriott.